Well, that was certainly a grace-filled moment. And now it's time to move ahead with our first speakers is Ty and Charlene Bollinger. Ty and Charlene are highly regarded health freedom advocates, health researchers, documentary film producers, and best-selling authors. After losing several family members to conventional cancer treatments, they set out to learn the truth about cancer and the cancer industry. Working together tirelessly to help others learn the truth that sets them free to live healthy and happy lives, Ty and Charlene's heartbreak and grief, coupled with their firm belief that chemotherapy, radiation, and surgery were not the most effective means of treatments available to cancer patients, and that has led them on their path of discovery. On their journey, they interviewed cutting-edge scientists, leading alternative doctors, groundbreaking researchers to learn about alternative cancer treatments. What they uncovered helped to create the truth about cancer. Ty and Charlene speak frequently at seminars, such as this, expos, conferences, and churches. Together, they host a bi-weekly internet news program called the, TTAC.
Global Health News.
Yeah, the TTAC Global Health News. Thank you, Ty. With that, I'll turn it over to Ty. Very nice to meet you.
Pleasure to meet you.
Thank you.
All right, thank you. Thank you, Dr. Don, especially. I have not been given instructions on this thing, but I think I can probably figure it out. I'll do my best here. I greet you on behalf of my wife, Charlene. Unfortunately, she could not make it. She last evening, she's like got something totally cricked out of her neck, just threw her neck out. So she's having to get emergency chiropractic to where she can move again. And then we're actually flying this afternoon. Hopefully she'll be with me to fly down to Orlando. We got to speak there tonight. So greetings from Charlene. She wished she could be here. I want to say thank you especially to Dr. Don. She has been fantastic. We had to change the time we spoke so that we could then fly to Orlando to get there in time to speak tonight. And so she had to move people around and stuff. We were probably very needy speakers, I guess you want to call us. And she was very accommodating as a host. So thank you so much, Dr. Don. Please give her a hand for coordinating this. We know how difficult it is to coordinate an event like this because we do this as well. So thank you, Dr. Don. Thank you, Dr. Tom, for referring us over here to Dr. Lokenskar. So I have till 10 o'clock. Is that right? 90 minutes? Yes? Class is still asleep. I'll wake you up. No worries. So today I was going to speak with Charlene, but it'll just be me, so I'll cover everything. The truth about cancer and the truth about vaccines. So let's get rolling. Let's see if I can work this thing properly. There we go. Okay, cool. This is the why. So people ask, why are you doing this? The why is our family. It's our children. It's to give them a future, because in case you haven't been paying attention, which I'm sure that you have, there is active suppression of information now going on. And I'll get to that during the lecture. It's open now with social media and with the search engines. And so it's going to get harder and harder if we don't all band together to get this information out there, because there is, well, I'll just use the C word. There is a conspiracy to suppress this information. And we'll get to that today. This is some of the documentaries that we've done. The one on the bottom right there, Eastern Medicine, we're actually airing that right now. So if you haven't seen Eastern Medicine, go check it out. Our website is thetruthaboutcancer.com, and you can sign up there and watch it for free. I think we're on episode 2 right now of 7 episodes. We went to Asia last summer and discovered what they were doing to treat cancer there. Pretty interesting. This is what got us going. The year was 1995. My father, Graham Bollinger, seen here in this picture. Believe it or not, he was about the same age I am right now. He died at 52. He was diagnosed with cancer. He died 6 months after he was diagnosed. And there's his gravestone, along with my mother, who died several years later of cancer. And in between, we lost 5 other family members, including both granddads, grandmom, cousin, and uncle, all to cancer. So this is not something that we had this master plan. Hey, we're going to start the Truth About Cancer organization and educate people about cancer. This is something that we kind of backed into because everybody in my family started dropping like flies from cancer. And actually, I say that I better get my hand out of my pocket here. It's a real funny story. I'll go on tangents sometimes. I was going through, we were in Waco, Texas this last weekend. I took our son Bryce, down to Waco for a Baylor baseball tryout. On the way back, we were at DFW, or at Love Field in Dallas, I was going through security, and I walked like this. I had my hand in my pocket, because this is just how I'm comfortable. Goodness gracious, the TSA lady said, "Hands out of your pocket, hands out of your pocket." And I literally went like this. And it just frightened me. So I walked back, and she said, "You got to go through again." And so I started to go through again with my hands up like this. And she said, "Don't go through until I tell you you can." I was like, goodness gracious, this lady's on a total power trip here. And it's like, I guess somehow if you have your hands in your pocket covering up something you shouldn't be taking through, the metal detector won't sense it, right? Whatever. Anyway, back to the story here. So this is what got us going on researching. And when Dad died in 1996, really began to dive down the rabbit hole in research and found out that there was good evidence that there is an active campaign to suppress cancer treatments, natural cancer treatments in the United States. And I know we're here at a biological dentist conference, but it applies to dentistry as well. It applies to a lot of dentists that are trying to think outside the box. It applies to chiropractic. It applies to a lot of different areas of what we might think of as outside of the mainstream of modern medicine. But that's why. So if you're diagnosed with cancer, these are your options pretty much in the United States. Now, as we found out in Asia, we went last summer to Japan, Taiwan, Malaysia, Philippines, Singapore, Thailand, India. We found out that these are not your only options overseas, but they are here. And another thing that we found out overseas is that oncologists don't think of, so if you're diagnosed here, you go to the doctor and he's like, "Yeah, you got to do chemo and radiation, and we'll cut it out first, and probably chemo, radiation. That's your options." And then, "Well, is there anything else I can do, doc?" "Oh, you're thinking about doing some of those alternative treatments," right? So there's like this division between the natural treatments and what's approved, the conventional treatments. But in Asia, there's not. It's just there's this whole bucket of treatments that you can use, and the oncologist picks what they can, what works. So if they want to do low-dose chemotherapy to get the cancer under control to start with, and then couple that with detoxification and saunas and light therapy and even laughter therapy. Most of the countries have laughter therapy, and we'll talk about that a little bit today. It's all fine, except for in Singapore. Singapore's the exception to all those countries, but all the other countries, even Japan, Philippines, they have laws that allow a doctor to use any treatment that works, which is really what we should do, right? If it works, we should use it. We shouldn't be put in a situation like, for instance, Dr. Brzezinski. Who's familiar with Dr. Brzezinski? Okay, almost everyone, half the room probably, down in Texas. So he's been persecuted for curing cancer, right? Because the treatment was not approved. He's not been persecuted for people dying from his treatments. He's been persecuted because it was working, but it wasn't approved, which is bizarre. It's like the people are alive. He's got what he calls his wall of heroes down there in Houston, and we've been to his office multiple times, and it's pictures of babies that were diagnosed with some sort of brain cancer, which he specializes in, and then it's a picture of them when they're diagnosed, and then when they were in grade school, and then when they were in junior high, and then high school, and then college, and getting married, and then them with their kids. So he's followed them over many years. He's literally reversing brain cancer in many of these children. It is working for many, but he gets persecuted because it's not approved by the FDA. And again, the problem with these treatments, as you can see, if you can't see this from the back, the problem with these is that chemo radiation surgery also can cause or spread cancer. So it's bizarre that we're in a time where the treatments that are recommended actually cause the disease they're supposed to treat. And then this is a screenshot. You probably can't see it because I can barely see it from right here. But this is a screenshot. This is a study that was done at Northern Sydney Cancer Center, Sydney, Australia. It was the most comprehensive study that I'm aware of that has been done on analyzing the contribution of chemotherapy to a 5-year survival rate, which is what we typically look at, right? How many people made 5 years? And then this was this study, which was 22 different types of cancer, if you count all the way down, I believe 22 different types. And then the bottom right there, I don't think I have a little pointy thing, but the little pink box. Is there? The green light. Oh, I love it. Okay. High tech here. I can start shooting at y'all. Actually, I'm going on a tangent again. There were some people that had really high-powered lasers like this. They were shooting it at a football game a couple weeks ago at the quarterback, so it would blind him. Anyway, it has nothing to do with what we're talking about here. But this analysis of chemotherapy showed that in Australia, as far as the contribution to a 5-year survival rate, 2.1%. Okay, 2.1%. In the U.S., I think it was 2.3%. So it just doesn't really contribute that much to living, you know? It seems like it would, but it doesn't. 2.1 effective 5-year survival. And this is a study that was done on 32,000 patients. This was published a few years ago in Lancet Oncology, which is not some throwaway journal, right? It's a pretty reputable medical journal, especially for cancer. 23,000 breast cancer, 9,600 lung cancer. The study actually showed the conclusion was that chemo kills approximately 50% of the people that undergo chemotherapy. In other words, they die from the treatment instead of the cancer. And that's actually what happened to my father. He didn't undergo chemo. He went in, as I mentioned, he was about my age. I'm almost 52. He was 52 when he died. He went in for stomach pain, and they went in to do exploratory surgery. They thought he had gallstones, and they came out a few hours later, and they said, it's cancer. Wow, it's all over his stomach. It's so advanced. He's so young. The doctor was almost in tears, at which point my mother pretty much collapsed, and because we weren't expecting that. We thought he had a stomach ache. Well, they cut his stomach out, about 75% of his stomach out, and then over the course of 25 days, he basically bled to death. He had 19 blood transfusions in 25 days, and in the end, they just didn't sew him up right. He died from the surgery. The initial prognosis after the surgery was that if he did nothing, he had 2 years, which is kind of bizarre, isn't it? Doctors, they pronounce death upon you at a certain time, like they're God or something, which they're not. But they said if he doesn't do anything 2 years, he died in 25 days. He didn't die from cancer, he died from the surgery. The death certificate said cancer, but he died from the surgery. And this is a case in point of dying from the treatment. So you're familiar with Dr. Brzezinski. Who's familiar with Thomas Navarro, the case of Thomas Navarro? A couple of people. Thomas Navarro was diagnosed with a brain cancer. It was a medulloblastoma, okay? This was back in the mid-90s. His parents, Jim and Donna, who we've interviewed actually, they wanted to take Thomas to Dr. Brzezinski's clinic because he, at that point, and he still does, had very good success rate with different types of brain cancer, including medulloblastoma. However, the FDA does not allow you, especially with pediatric cancer, to treat it, quote, alternatively until you've exhausted the conventional treatments, which is chemo, radiation, surgery. So even though the oncologist said, he told the parents, I don't think this chemo is going to work. And even though the chemo package insert said, and I'll shine it here, this drug has not been proven safe or effective for pediatric use. And Thomas was 4, so I would say that was pediatric use. They still had to do it before they could go to Brzezinski to get his brain cancer treated effectively. So on his death certificate, he died in 18 months. Chronic toxicity of chemotherapy is listed as one of the causes for death. So the forensic pathologist in this case was at least honest. He died from the chemotherapy. He was 6 years old when they buried him. So here's a question for you. Can you answer this? Why is the oncologist not in jail? He said he didn't think it'd work. Parents had to do this in order to get the child treated. The child died. Now, I'm not saying that the oncologist tried to murder the kid, but I'm just saying, why is nobody held accountable for this? That these treatments are required and the treatments are actually causing death, and then no one's held accountable. Who's familiar with the Dr. Farid Fatah, speaking of jail? Dr. Farid Fatah, Dr. Lokenskard is. There's probably a couple more people here that are either asleep or just afraid to raise their hand because they're afraid they might get called on. I did used to teach math, actually, before I graduated from Baylor in 1991 with a master's degree in taxation. Worked for a few years for an accounting firm, Ernst & Young. You've probably heard of them. and then decided that wasn't for me. And then I taught school for 3 years, and I taught high school math. I taught geometry, trig, and calculus. So that was a ploy that all the kids used. It was like if they look down at their plate, or at their plate you're eating in here, if you look down at your book, maybe you won't get called on, right? So that's what I look for. Anybody who's looking down was going to get called on. So back to this. Again, that had nothing to do with this. But I do like to go on tangents, especially early in the morning to keep you awake. So speaking of jail, why is Dr. Fareed Fatah not in jail? This man, oncologist, Detroit, Michigan, he was convicted about 2 years ago of fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy. What did he do? He billed Medicare over a period of about 10 years over $350 million for chemotherapy agents used on his patients, of which he collected about $93 million. So almost $10 million a year on average that he pulled in for chemotherapy from Medicare. Now, the thing was that many of his patients that he prescribed it for didn't even have cancer. And many of them that had cancer, it was the wrong, I'd say they're all wrong, but it was the wrong kind of chemotherapy. Probably people assume that he billed these types of chemo because they were more expensive. But he was the wrong chemo, or it was chemo to somebody that didn't have cancer. Some of the people that he prescribed chemo to that didn't have cancer actually died from the chemo. Okay, so he is in jail. Thank God he's doing 45 years. He's criminal. People died because of this. So there are instances where oncologists are getting caught. Now, oncologists are not bad people. I'm not anti-doctor, anti-oncologist, but it's the system. The system's broken. Here's why. Because oncologists can actually buy chemo at wholesale and they mark it up at retail and sell it. Did you know that? It's the only drug that I'm aware of that a medical doctor can mark up and sell to the patients. Okay. System's broken. So we're going to give you a quiz here, class, early in the morning to keep you awake. What's the number one cause of death in the United States? Cancer? Heart disease? Some doctors. Okay, we got a really bright class here. I heard iatrogenic. Answer, I'm a doctor. The doctors, iatrogenic causes are the number one cause of death. Very good. What does iatrogenic mean? Iatrogenic means caused by medical procedure. Okay, and this is not something that's conspiracy theory. The mainstream's even starting to cover it now. Study finds epidemic of errors in hospitals and healthcare facilities. I call them death care facilities sometimes. Iatrogenicide. It means caused by medical procedure. I keep getting a little bit of a, I wonder if something's hitting.
It's not, we got some interference.
Okay, it's not me then. Okay, it's not you, it's me. So in 2006, there was a report that was done by Dr. Gary Noel, Carolyn Dean, several other medical doctors, and they just looked at the cause of death that year and determined that in 2006, there was 783,000 deaths in the U.S. that were iatrogenic, caused by some sort of medical procedure. And here's the breakdown. At the very top, 106,000 caused by non-error negative effect of drugs, all the way down, hospital infections, medical error, bed sores, unnecessary procedures. I'm reading this because I know at the back you can't see it. Usually I don't read the slides because y'all can read, but if you can't see it, I'm going to help you out. Malnutrition, outpatients, surgery-related, all the way down in the red at the bottom, 783,000 people that year died from medical-related issues, okay? Now, here's the one that blows me. Which one blows you away the most? Bed sores? Malnutrition? I mean, it's all a shame, right, that people are dying from this. That's why sometimes I call hospitals are death facilities. It's where people go to die. So that's what hospice is. Good people in hospice. Charlene's mom's worked in hospice, but that's basically where you go to die. But here's the one that blows me away, is the top one. 106,000 that year died from non-error negative effect of drugs. What does that mean? They were properly prescribed and properly used. Think about that. FDA approves drugs. Doctor prescribes drugs. Patient takes drugs. Patient dies from drugs properly taken. And nothing happens. They just keep making more drugs. Can you imagine? Dr. Tom's a big proponent of ozone. Dr. Lokensgaard is our family dentist, and he's used ozone on us many times. Can you imagine if one of his patients died of the ozone? Just one. he'd be shut down immediately, right? Just one. But this number is not this is not a secret number. This is a number that's published on FDA.gov. They list the reasons for death each year, and they list on FDA.gov that 100,000 people die each year in the U.S. alone to drugs that they've approved that are properly prescribed and properly taken. Well, what do you say to that? I don't get it. That's the one that blows me away. And then the drug train just keeps on spinning. More drugs keep getting pumped out. As a matter of fact, my grandma, used to live in Dallas. She died when she was 92, but when she was in her mid-80s, she fell, hurt, she broke her hip, I think, so she had to go to this facility, and we didn't like her having to stay in a facility, a rehab facility, so we built that extra room in our house and moved her in with us. And I was responsible for getting together her medications that she took each day. And she was on 15 different prescriptions. Now, only 2 or 3 of those were for the symptoms that she had 10 years before. She started taking a few in her mid-70s, early 70s. And then those drugs started having side effects. And then the doctor would prescribe another drug to mitigate the side effect that the first or second or third drug had caused. And then the cycle continued. So that when 10, 15 years later, whenever it was that she was living with us, she was taking 15 drugs a day. And only a few were for the original problems. See, it's a gravy train. I graduated, told you, Baylor University in 1991. I had a fraternity brother that worked for one of the big pharmaceutical companies. And he was on the board of directors. And he quit. And he said, I can't do this anymore. And I asked him why. He said, well, because in our planning meetings, we go through the drugs that we're about to release. And we've already had the statisticians doing the analysis on how many people are going to get sick from the drugs, how many people are going to die from the drugs, how many lawsuits we'll have as a result of the deaths from the drugs. And then in the end, our bean counters weigh out the pros and the cons, the money versus the lawsuits. And if we're in a plus position, we launch the drug. He couldn't do it anymore. So again, annual deaths from FDA-approved drugs, 100,000. I'm not aware of anybody that's ever overdosed on a supplement. There may be a couple of anecdotal cases out there that say somebody might have taken too much vitamin C or whatever, but that'll just cause diarrhea. I don't think it's going to cause death. But we do have opioid-induced constipation. This is what I was talking about. We do have now diseases, quote diseases, these symptoms that are created by the drugs that people are taking. Who's heard of OIC? OIC, opioid-induced constipation. This is a new disease that they're treating. It's actually not a disease, it's constipation caused by opioids, because the first thing that happens if you take an opioid is what? It causes paralysis of your intestinal tract. You don't eliminate your waste anymore. It goes from the gut out to make you feel good, but it stops your peristalsis from working. So people can't have a bowel movement. So what do? Rather than getting them off of the opioids, we just produce another drug to help with the opioids. Now with the constipation, and here Movantik is an opioid antagonist used to treat OIC. I would just say, get off the opioids, right? Find some other pain medication that is more natural, that doesn't cause constipation. Like cannabis. I'll talk about cannabis shortly. Great pain medication, but it's been demonized. Common side effects include abdominal pain, diarrhea, nausea, flatulence, vomiting, and headache. I'm not sure which is worse, constipation or the side effects of the drug. I'll read this to you here in a second for you at the back. So this is Big Pharma. Here's your opioids. See you next week, and 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 next week. That's the model. It's a perpetual model. It's a very effective model. And if you look at it from a pure business perspective, which I majored in business at Baylor, it's a great business model. Okay? I'm just eliminating the moral aspect of it. Okay? Eliminating the fact that people are dying from the drugs. But just from a business model, it's a beautiful model, right? You're creating a product, if you're pharma. Dr. Tony Jimenez, what's up, buddy? You're late. I'm going to ask you the first question. I will ask you the question now. How was it last year in July traveling with us to Asia to 7 countries? Wasn't that great?
Oh, that was amazing.
He was on the team. Cool. Good answer. Had he said anything negative, I would have had to tell him to go out in the hall. Now, Dr. Tony was with us when we went to Asia. It was a great trip. But that's the model. It's just perpetual prescribing of drugs and creating new drugs, despite the fact that they're harming people. But just from a business perspective, it's a great model because you're creating business with your products. I mean, wouldn't it be great to be able to sell a product to somebody that then created a need for another product, that then created a need for another product, and you were creating the next products? It's a great business model, but unfortunately, we've lost the human aspect of this business model and the fact that people are actually getting harmed and killed by some of these drugs. So what if I told you there was a conspiracy to cover up cancer treatments because cancer is a multi-billion-dollar industry? Would you believe it? Is it a conspiracy theory? It's not a theory. It's not a theory. I mean, you have conspiracies happen all the time, right? The term conspiracy is now a bad word, or it's a word you don't want to be associated with, but it happens all the time. Like, I'm a big football fan. By the way, did you see the Steelers-Browns game last night? Anybody? I'm a big Steelers fan. Steelers got killed. But the last play, one of the Browns ripped the Steelers quarterback's helmet off and hit him over the head with it. I'm not making it up. You'll be all over the news today. But when a quarterback goes back into the huddle and they gather together, they're actually conspiring to score. That's conspiracy. It's not negative. It's not positive. It's just a conspiracy. Anytime that you do something like that in private without somebody else knowing it and you're planning on doing it to that other person or group, it's conspiracy. So they conspire to score. When the World Series just ended, when the manager walks out to the pitcher's mound and they huddle up with the catcher and they're talking, they're conspiring to try to get the batter out. I mean, conspiracy is not a bad word, but there are conspiracies to suppress treatments, and I think a lot of people in this room probably are familiar with that. Here's the Fitzgerald Report of 1953. Who's seen the Fitzgerald Report of 1953? This is a screenshot. This is in the appendix to the Congressional Record, United States, 1953. The United States Senate commissioned Bennett Fitzgerald, who was he worked with the Interstate Commerce Committee. He was an investigative reporter for the government. And they tasked him with determining if there was a conspiracy to suppress cancer treatments at that time. And after months of research and traveling and interviews, he determined that, yes, there was a conspiracy to suppress natural cancer treatments. I'll read a couple quotes for you. Public and private funds have been thrown around like confetti at a country fair to close up and destroy clinics, hospitals, and scientific research labs which do not conform to the viewpoint of medical associations. There is reason to believe that the AMA has been hasty, capricious, arbitrary, and outright dishonest in an interstate conspiracy of alarming proportions. And then lastly, behind and over all this is the weirdest conglomeration of corrupt motives, intrigue, selfishness, jealousy, obstruction, and conspiracy that I have ever seen. This is in the appendix to the Congressional Record. What did they determine? They determined there was a conspiracy to suppress natural cancer treatments at that time. They were talking specifically about Laetrile, which is vitamin B17, and apricot seeds. That was the conspiracy that they looked at this point. So is there a conspiracy, Matt? Are you a conspiracy theorist if you think so? Apparently, U.S. Senate, all conspiracy theorists as well. Who's familiar with Wilk versus the American Medical Association? Wilk versus AMA? Just a couple people. Good. What is Wilk versus AMA? This was a lawsuit filed by Chester Wilk, who was a chiropractor in the 1980s. He sued the American Medical Association, said they were in a conspiracy to suppress chiropractic care, that they were slandering, that they were lying about chiropractic in order to push people into, quote, conventional treatment and protocols rather than let them go and do some chiropractic care. And what did Judge Susan Getzendanner rule? She described this as systematic long-term wrongdoing and the long-term intent to destroy a licensed profession. She said, yes, there is a conspiracy against chiropractic. So it's not a theory, it's fact, right? Why do these conspiracies exist, though, against natural medicine? That's what we'll get to. Give you a quiz here. Who are these fellows? Do you know? You know what? Charlene usually covers this. I'm not into the movies as much, but these are... Yeah, Hemsworth. Yeah, so one of these guys, I think that's the guy that plays Thor, and this is the guy that does other movies. Hunger Games, okay, cool. Charlene and the kids always watch all the Marvel stuff. I'm not into that as much. But anyway, these are apparently two pretty well-known actors in the United States. All right? Kind of lost the effect there. Who are these brothers? I do know these brothers, okay, because being older, yeah, I heard an ugh out there. I'll just do it for the whole group. Ugh. Has anybody heard, by the way, remember the oldest brother here, Alec right there, he's a lot older now. Has anybody heard him when he had his radio show? He had a radio show for a while, back in the late 90s, early 2000s. It was hard to listen to, because they were only on for a couple of shows, and then they killed it because nobody called in. And there's literally, you can go out there and you can, I used to say Google it, but Google is now suppressing, so I don't say Google anymore, because if you go out to Google, you try to find the truth about cancer, you won't be able to find us. Even though we have 1,100 indexed articles plus, you won't be able to find us on Google because they're suppressing the truth about cancer. So if you go out and do a search for these guys, you will be able to look at Alex. You'll be able to see Alex's radio show blunder, and it was hard to listen to, because he called in. He's like on the air, and he's like, "Okay, so do we have any callers? Do we have any callers? Okay, yeah. I'm looking. I don't see any lights on the phone. Does that mean there's no callers? There's no. Okay. Well, we're going to wait here for it, and hopefully we'll have some callers. I mean, it's hard to listen to. I felt bad for him. I don't like him. And let's see, there's Daniel. That's the oldest brother. He was hitting on Charlene down at Starbucks a few years ago down in Texas, with his wife in the Starbucks, though. Okay. Who are these brothers? These are, anybody know? Orville, Wilbur Wright, I get a lot. These are the Flexner brothers. So who's familiar with the Flexner Report of 1910? Okay, a few of us. This is why medical suppression occurs today. Flexner Report of 1910, I'm going to cover it very quickly, but this is a report that has literally paved the way for the direction that medical school education is today, and it happened over 100 years ago, the Flexner Report of 1910. Those two brothers, Abraham and Simon Flexner, actually it was Abraham Flexner. Simon Flexner was on the board of the Rockefeller Foundation. He referred the Rockefellers and the Carnegies to his brother Abraham to head up a task force to determine which medical schools in the United States were teaching sound medicine. And so they visited over 300 medical schools in the U.S., and they determined that there was a lot of medical schools that were not teaching, quote, sound medicine. What was the preordained conclusion of this report? This was a setup, right? This was not an independent evaluation. This was to determine which schools were pushing pharmaceutical medicine, and to help them to flourish and to push out natural medicine. That was what they wanted, because Rockefeller owned Standard Oil, right? He owned an oil company. They also had their hand in other chemical companies. And did you know that most pharmaceutical drugs are petrol-based? They're petrol-based petrochemical-based. They're oil-based. So he was looking at a way to push out his oil derivative drugs and monopolize the market. And the way he did it is he squashed competition, right? That was Rockefeller's #1 mantra. Competition is a sin. So this was a way for him to push out the competition with pharmaceutical-based drugs, petrol-based drugs. And he did. Through the Flexner Report of 1910, it was a preordained conclusion. The Flexner traveled with the head of the AMA across to all these 300-plus medical schools. They submitted a report to Congress, and I'll hurry up here because I want to get into the meat, and I'm already 30-plus minutes in. Okay. So I sounded louder there for a second to myself. Okay, cool. No worries. Okay. So what happened with the Flexner report? They submitted it to Congress, and they basically said that these medical schools that are pushing like all this woo-woo stuff like chiropractic and homeopathy and herbalism, they're not teaching sound medicine. You know, these are not solid medical schools, but the ones that are pushing drugs are. That was the conclusion, and that became the new criteria for medical schools in the United States. And then to finish off, you know, this coup d'etat, they funded the medical schools that were pushing drugs with something like $500 million of funding, and of course a seat on the board of directors at those institutions. So the medical schools that were pushing drugs basically got the funding. They got a seat on the board to Rockefeller, Carnegie, somebody AMA related, to make sure that they continued pushing drugs in their curriculum. And then by 1925, over 10,000 herbalists were out of business, and within 15 years. By 1940, over 1,500 chiropractors were actually prosecuted for practicing quackery. And then by the 22 homeopathic medical schools that flourished in 1900 dwindled to just 2 by 1923, and by 1950, all the schools that were teaching homeopathy were closed. They effectively gained control of the medical school curriculum in the United States with the Flexner Report, and ensured that they would maintain control by the funding and the seats on the board to push those medical institutions in the way of patent petrochemical drugs. That's why doctors today learn how to push pills when they're in medical school, back to the Flexner Report of 1910. If you understand that, you can now tell your friends why your doctor does not know about this, because they've never been educated because of the Flexner Report of 1910. And by the way, I've got the little ducks on there. Why are the ducks there? Quackery. The first time that the word quackery was ever used in the United States to refer to doctors was in 1913 as a result of the American Medical Association beginning an active campaign to call doctors who were not pushing drugs quacks. That was the first time it was ever applied to biological dentists. Dentists hear that a lot, especially biological. Oh, you're a quack. Chiropractors, oh, quack. Homeopath, oh, homeopathy, that's quackery, right? That was the first time that term was ever used. And it was a result of the American Medical Association pushing that into our consciousness. They're not taught nutrition, only drugs when in medical school. That's the problem. That's why your doctor doesn't know that what you eat matters to your health. Doesn't know that nutrition matters, because they're never taught that. I went to school at Baylor and roomed for a semester with a good buddy of mine who's now a medical doctor in San Antonio. He read, the first book we published was in 2006. It was called Cancer, Step Outside the Box. He read it, and he's like, you're crazy. All this nutrition stuff doesn't matter. And then a couple years later, he calls me up. He's like, you know what? I was wrong. It does matter. I started following some of your dietary advice in the book and dropped 50 pounds, and now I feel better than I ever felt in college. And he was 40 years old at the time. And he said, it does matter. I was never taught this stuff. They never taught us nutrition in college. I didn't know that this mattered. As a matter of fact, the doctors know so little about nutrition, and I'm just speaking generally here. There's some doctors that understand nutrition better than others. But when he dropped 50 pounds, he literally got called into the medical review board at his hospital because they didn't understand how someone could lose that much weight without taking drugs, and thought he was taking cocaine or crack because he dropped so much weight so fast. And he's like, no, I've been drinking green smoothies and exercising. And they're like, you're lying. You got to be taking drugs. It's because they're not taught in medical school about this. Annual deaths each year, 435,000 people die from tobacco, 365K from poor diet, alcohol, all the way down. Prescription drugs is in there, 100,000, all the way down to peanuts actually kill 100 people. And peanut oil is used in the production of many vaccines. So we wonder if that's related to vaccination. And then down at the bottom, it says marijuana, 0. I don't like to call cannabis marijuana, but that's the slang term for it. But cannabis hadn't killed anybody from overdose. Now, I'm sure there's people that have smoked some pot and gone out and driven and gotten in a car wreck or whatever. I know that's happened. But as far as overdoses, there's none. You can't overdose. And most of the damage, we're told, and I'll get into the conspiracy against cannabis, but we're told that it's an evil weed that will cause you to, commit violence against, go act violently against your fellow man or whatever. That was what was told to us in the 1930s. That's not my experience with it. I knew a lot of guys that experimented with cannabis in college, and the only thing they attacked was the Dorito bag. Okay, so let this sink in for a minute. The government is at war with a plant that's never actually killed anyone ever, but they're losing because we're getting more of this, medicinal marijuana states. And like I said, it's hemp. The plant's hemp. It's cannabis. There's different levels of cannabinoids, which is the medicinal chemical constituents, but it's not marijuana. The plant was never called marijuana until the 1930s, okay? Again, the person that creates the vernacular wins the argument, right? And that's what the AMA did with the term quacks in the 1910-12 period. And that's what they did with cannabis in the 1930s, the DEA. Did you know that it was never, that this plant was never called marijuana before the DEA introduced that to us when they were looking to make it illegal in the 30s? Now, there's different theories about how they came up with the name. The most popular theory is that they took the two of the most popular Hispanic names, Maria and Juan, and put it together in marijuana. But regardless of how that name came about, it was never called that. Now, why do I tell you that? Well, because in 1937 is when the Marijuana Stamp Act was passed, and it effectively made this plant illegal. But prior to that time, the American Medical Association and all the doctors used cannabis oil in their clinics, and it was in every pharmacy, over the counter. Even THC, high THC, which is the psychoactive component, that was available, okay, until they made it illegal. And the reason they made it illegal is because they said, I'm trying to not clear my throat in your ear, but I'll just do it. The reason that they made it illegal is they pushed on the American consciousness that marijuana is a drug that will make you so violent that you'll become an axe murderer or a serial rapist. And they pushed it on the consciousness. Who's heard of Reefer Madness? Reefer Madness, propaganda film back in the 30s. It's on today still. On one of the movie channels I recorded a few weeks ago and watched it. It's actually kind of funny, but then you see, it's almost shot as a comedy, but you see them pushing people smoking pot and then doing violent acts. They pushed it on our consciousness. Well, it just doesn't happen that way. But that was a propaganda film. And the AMA used cannabis oil, and all the doctors used it, the clinics used it, the pharmacies sold it, and they did not know when the DEA started pushing the need to make this new drug illegal, they didn't know that marijuana was the same thing as cannabis. They used another term and effectively got it outlawed. And afterwards, one of the heads of the AMA testified before Congress and said, had we known that marijuana was actually the same thing as cannabis, we would have fought against this because we used this in all our clinics. But it's too late after they passed the law. That's why it's called Marijuana Day. That's why I don't like to call it marijuana. It's hemp, it's cannabis. There's different cannabinoids, there's like 40 plus different cannabinoids in cannabis, maybe even more now. But is it a miracle plant or an evil weed? I was taught that it was an evil weed. I did a report in high school about how evil marijuana was. That's what I was taught. And I'm a Christian and grew up going to church, and everybody in church thought it was the evil weed too. So, of course, I joined on the bandwagon and did a report about how evil it was. Dad used to work for the Forest Service. We lived in Virginia. He worked for the National Forest Service in Virginia. And I remember times when they would go out on marijuana raids. He would be up in a helicopter. They'd find the fields, sweep down, cut down all the plants. And I remember one time he had his whole government car full of marijuana plants. Dropped by the house on his way back to work, and it was like plants coming out his windows and stuff. I'm like, what is that? He's like, well, that's marijuana. We just confiscated, 500 plants of marijuana. That's what we were taught. Again, it's brainwashing. And I'm not saying that if you're pro-cannabis as medicine, that you have to be in favor of your 8-year-old smoking pot. That's not a fair equivalency. There's a lot of uses for this plant that are being denied to people, specifically medicinal uses, because there's one use that can get you high. And there was an article in 1938 that was published in Popular Mechanics, and it was something like 25,000 uses for the hemp plant. There's only one use is getting high. There's a lot of other uses. And as you can see from this slide, all of the founding fathers grew cannabis. All of them did. And as a matter of fact, in the colony of Virginia from 1763 to 1769, you're required to grow it because it was so useful as a crop. Many of the Rembrandts and Van Goghs were painted on hemp paper. The original Model Ts were on hemp, ran on hemp oil, hemp gasoline, I guess. Okay, and they were constructed with hemp fiber. So it's a very versatile plant. But it's illegal because of this propaganda campaign, Reefer Madness I spoke about. Here's what's interesting. There's a lot of doublespeak that goes on with cannabis. It was Dr. James Woodward, by the way, that was the AMA physician that I mentioned that testified before Congress, right up here. But this is doublespeak. One of Harry Anslinger, who was the head of the Drug Enforcement, DEA, it was called the Drug Commission back then. It became the DEA. So back in the 30s, when they were trying to make marijuana, cannabis illegal, he said this: it will make the users extremely violent, you know, following up this deal with the reefer madness. However, 20 years later at the McCarthy trials, the same man, Anslinger, testified and said that marijuana will pacify you so much that soldiers would not want to fight. He's trying to not give our soldiers access to cannabis, but it's the same plant. So in 20 years, did it magically transmutate into a violent, you know, from a violent plant into a plant that will make you pacify? No. It depends on the audience. He's a politician, right? Depends on who he's speaking to. So he wanted to make it outlawed, then it would make you extremely violent. Didn't want to give the soldiers access to it, but it wasn't because if it made you extremely violent, you would think that would be a good drug for the soldiers, right? Didn't want to give the soldiers access, so now it will pacify you so much you want to fight. Depends on the audience. It's like when I went to high school in Louisiana, and our governor in Louisiana at that time was named Edwin Edwards. Who's familiar with Edwin Edwards? He was an amazing politician. Not a great guy, but he was a great politician, because when he would speak up in Shreveport, he would sound just like I do, because Shreveport is not Cajun. But when he spoke in New Orleans, he automatically had a new Cajun accent. That's not a Cajun accent. I don't know what that was. But he sounded like a Cajun when he was in New Orleans and Baton Rouge. But when he was in Shreveport, he sounded just like the rest of us. So depending upon the audience, you change your message. And that's what happened here with marijuana. And there was a lot of racism that went into it too. It would never work today. This is a quote on the floor of Congress: "Reefer makes darkies think they're as good as white men." Lots of racism that went into this too. And as a matter of fact, there's quotes that say that marijuana will make white women have relations with Negroes and Filipinos, and they're evil music or something. I mean, the quotes that you can read that happened when this was getting outlawed today, you'd be like, wow. I mean, one tweet and they're gone. You know, I mean, nobody's going to listen to these people anymore. But back then, that was the mantra. And there is a conspiracy against cannabis and cancer. 1974 was the first study on cannabis and cancer by the University of Virginia Medical School. The DEA commissioned them to study if it was. They wanted to show that it caused cancer. Actually, that was the wanted conclusion of the study. They wanted, because Nixon had just declared a war on cancer and a war on drugs, and they're going to like get a 2-for-1 here, right? It's illegal as a drug. Now we want to show that it also causes cancer. Well, the University of Virginia Medical School showed that it actually curative in 3 types of cancer. It reversed 3 types of cancer. So they buried the study. Buried the study. We didn't learn about that for 20 years. UCLA Medical School professor fights lung cancer. Here's some shots of that a guy sent us. He was going to be dead. You know, he was diagnosed as terminal, used cannabis oil. Harvard study, 2007, cannabis and lung cancer. I'm just showing you screenshots of studies on cannabis. Here's more. These are screenshots in scientific journals: breast cancer, colon, prostate, skin, uterine, pancreatic, thyroid, cervical, biliary tract cancer. Cannabis has been shown effective to reverse all these different types of cancers. It's probably the most heavily studied plant when it comes to cancer, up there with turmeric, the anti-cancer effects. It's not just cancer, though. It's epilepsy. This is the little boy named Ethan, I believe. Sorry, Hawk. And he was in a constant state of epileptic seizure a few years ago. I read about this. They lived in Georgia, but they weren't able to access cannabis there. He was doing like 300 seizures a day. I mean, almost constant seizure. He was actually, they had to put him into a medically induced coma several times to stop the seizures. They gave him cannabis oil, and literally within a couple of days, the seizures dropped to like 1 or 2 a day with cannabis oil. But he couldn't access it in Georgia. They had to move to Colorado. So, you know, what we really try to fight for, and our message is that people should have access to treatments, not forcing someone to use cannabis oil if they don't want to. But they shouldn't, you know, a little kid with epilepsy shouldn't have to uproot from Georgia to move to Colorado to get access to cannabis oil. You know, this was years ago. I think you probably could have more access because there's more freedom now. But we really want people just to have the freedom to choose their treatments without having to uproot and move or go overseas. This is a shot of somebody with melanoma that used cannabis oil over a period of like 60 days. Pretty amazing. This is from just a couple of weeks ago. I was speaking in Toronto a couple weeks ago, and one of the doctors sent me this photo. This was in Las Vegas at a nutritional supplement conference. This Asian man here that's getting handcuffed by the FDA brought in CBD oil illegally. I'm not sure how you can bring in something illegally that's legal, but he apparently didn't clear it properly, or I don't know. I don't know what all the laws are as far as importing CBD. Maybe that's a federal offense, but they arrested him and took him out of the nutritional supplement conference because he had illegally imported CBD oil. Now, here's the thing. The DEA has scheduled cannabis, or marijuana. Most people here would call it marijuana, but it's really cannabis, hemp. But they've scheduled marijuana as a Schedule I drug, right? You know what a Schedule I drug is? What's the definition? Bingo. A Schedule I drug has no known medical benefits. By definition, it has to have no known medical benefits. Otherwise, it can't be a Schedule I. Right? No medical purpose or use. That's the definition. Remember this. Did you know that the Department of Health and Human Services holds a patent on the medical use of cannabis? There's certain functions of the natural substance, different effects that they have patented. And here are some of the ones that they have patented. They have patented, apparently there is medical benefit, right? Because they have a patent on it. But they hold the patent on cannabis used for neurological diseases like Alzheimer's, stroke, Parkinson's, and diseases caused by oxidative stress, heart attack, Crohn's, diabetes, arthritis. So those are the two different umbrellas that they hold a patent on cannabis. And then just in case you're wondering what the number is, it's, I'm pointing at the screen up here, what an idiot. Right here, patent 6630507B. That's the number of the patent, so they have it patented. So apparently it can't be a Schedule I, but it is. And cannabis is also a superfood. I know people that use it in their smoothies every day. It has a great combination of fatty acids. It has a lot of GLA, gamma-linolenic acid, that other substances don't. And it's just great to throw in smoothies to actually eat. Now, the only way that the THC, which is the psychoactive component of cannabis, gets activated is if you heat it. So you can take, quote, pot all day long, and if you put it in a blender and blend it up and drink it, there's no psychoactive effect. It's got to be heated, okay? And speaking of food, this is our pyramid 50 years ago. This is our food pyramid. This is what it looked like. I remember in school looking at this going, yeah, okay, that's the way we're supposed to eat. This is what it looks like today. And this is no exaggeration. It really is. I was reading an article a few weeks ago that said in a recent survey, I think it was 30% of American adults had never eaten a fresh fruit or vegetable. They literally had always eaten boxed or packaged food. 30%. That seems unfathomable to me, because I mean that's what we live on, is fresh food. But if you look at the supermarkets today, I mean they've got a great variety of everything in a box or a package, right? If you shop in the middle aisles, that's all you see. If you shop around the edge, the refrigerated sections, that's where you get your fruits, vegetables, frozen meats, dairy, whatever. But everything in the middle is boxed or packaged. And that's where most people shop. And that's where the cheap stuff is, right? And so somebody that's lower income, that's what they can afford, right? And they're told that it doesn't matter. I mean, the doctor says your diet really doesn't matter, so why should they buy something more expensive? The stuff in the middle tastes better due to all the additives and MSG and the preservatives and the flavorings. So it tastes better. I mean, I don't think it does, but they make it taste good, and they make it addictive with the chemicals as well. It's more convenient. I mean, I get it. There's a lot of reasons why, but you know what? You can't afford to eat organic. And many people say they can. I was speaking up in Lexington, I think, a few years ago, and I was at a stop-and-go type store, and I was getting some water or something right before I went to speak, and this lady and her daughter was up right in front of me checking out, and the little girl grabs an apple, because, you know, they have like the impulse buys. They have apples, oranges, and bananas sometimes, and then a whole bunch of other crap. She grabs an apple, and she's like, I want this, and their mother says, what do you think? We're made of money? Put that back. So, you know, it's like probably $1 for an apple, but the mother was buying cigarettes and a lottery ticket and a soda. So they had money for that, but they didn't have money for the apple. So look, it's just priorities. If you prioritize eating organic, you can afford to, especially now. There's so much supply on the market, the prices have dropped. Like 10 years ago, I remember buying organic produce at like Whole Foods, which we called Whole Paycheck, because it was so expensive. But it's not anymore. You can get it at Publix and Kroger and H-E-B down in Texas and Winn-Dixie. I mean, everybody's got big organic sections now. And because of the supply and demand, the price is much lower. You can afford it. It's just a matter of prioritizing. This is a great little Chinese proverb. When diet is wrong, medicine is of no use. When diet is correct, medicine is of no need. Just think about that. It's profound. This is Grandma Helen. She died in 98. That's Mom with her. And Mom died in 2004. But before Grandma Helen died, for about 10 years, she was using a substance that you've probably heard of called Essiac tea. Essiac tea is an herbal remedy for cancer that's very effective. It contains burdock root, sheep sorrel, slippery elm, and Turkey rhubarb, those 4 ingredients. It was introduced to us by a nurse, Renee Case, C-A-I-S-S-E, up in Canada. And if you look at Case, that's Essiac is Case spelled backwards. That's where they came up with the name. C-A-I-S-S-E was her name. So Essiac tea, very effective. Grandma Helen took that for about 10 years before she died. She stopped taking it after Dad died, kind of threw the family into some chaos, and a couple years later she died. So literally it kept her cancer at bay for 10 years. And when she was told she had advanced cancer in the late 80s, she lived to the late 90s. And by the way, Canada persecuted Renee Case heavily for introducing a cancer treatment like Essiac tea that actually worked. So it's not just the United States that persecutes doctors and nurses for healing cancer naturally. Here's some other natural remedies for cancer. We're doing good. We've got 35 minutes left, so good, because we're going to hit some vaccine stuff here shortly. But CBD mixed with turmeric, this is a specific brand here. I'm not recommending that brand. I just found it's a nice picture. So I mean, they're mixing CBD with turmeric. And those, cannabis and turmeric, are 2 of the most heavily researched natural treatments for cancer. They're not researched as treatments. They're actually researched as anti-inflammatories, right? But if you look at the connection with inflammation and cancer, you'll find that cancer always results from chronic inflammation, okay? So they're very effective. Mistletoe extract, we did some interviews with doctors in India specifically that are using mistletoe very effectively for treating cancer. So lots of natural remedies, and you can find these all over the net. The problem is figuring out which one's right for you or your particular type of cancer, or which one you might want to employ as a preventative. That's where the decision making comes in. But the knowledge is out there. You know, the ketogenic diet, hyperbaric oxygen chambers, juicing, fermented foods, sunlight, apricot seeds, vitamin D, turmeric, enzymes, budwig, detox. This is just a few. There's hundreds of different treatments and combinations out there. This is just a few of them. And by the way, ketogenic diet, boy, I tell you, we have gotten just lambasted from people for talking about the ketogenic diet with cancer, because the vegans don't want you to use any kind of animal product. And look, if you're a vegan, God bless you, but the vegans typically are very religious about their belief that you should be a vegan, okay? And they're the only group that I know that think you should eat the way they eat. People that are using ketogenic diet aren't telling people you should only eat ketogenic, and so it's just kind of bizarre. And we've had alliances with people that have supported us for years that will no longer talk about the truth about cancer, because we had the audacity to mention the ketogenic diet, which, by the way, when we were in Manila, Philippines, and in Bangkok, Thailand, and in Malaysia, we interviewed dozens of cancer patients that used the ketogenic diet to reverse their cancer. But we've even been, we even had one person told us, we said, look, we've interviewed dozens of people that use ketogenic diet to reverse their cancer. And this one dude says, I don't care. So in other words, we're in danger of becoming as bad as the other side with the religious positions that you should only eat one diet. People are individuals, and you should be able to eat an individualized type diet that works for you, and you can figure that out and do it without being criticized or ostracized by other people trying to eat healthy too. You know, the bickering in this crowd is sometimes, it blows my mind. But anyway, that's a side tangent. That's at no charge. But in the middle here, apricot seeds. That's vitamin B17. That was the Fitzgerald report of 1953. They determined there was a conspiracy to suppress natural cancer treatments. It was apricot seeds. And apricot seeds are used by the Hunza Indians in northern Pakistan. And those people don't ever get cancer when they stay in their indigenous area. But when they move out and they start eating a diet like ours, they get sick. And this was actually the first we ever heard of natural cancer treatments back in the 1997 time period. 96 time period, when Dad got sick, started doing research, and we learned about Jason Vale here on the right. And this is me and Jason a few years ago, interviewed him in New York City. But he was actually diagnosed with terminal cancer at age 18. I think he was given 3 months to live, did a round of chemo, didn't work, made him sick, decided he was going to do something else, started reading books back then. Perhaps you've heard of books. Now kids are like, book. But, you know, it's not online. There was no internet back then. We read books about vitamin B17, found in apricot seeds and apple seeds, started eating them. By the way, he was a competitive arm wrestler, did very well, New York State champion. And his cancer reversed in a period of 6 to 8 months, eating apple and apricot seeds. So he started telling people about this online and got in a lot of trouble with the FDA. And eventually in 2002, I think it was, this is a picture of him in jail. He did 5 years in federal prison for having the audacity to sell apricot seeds online and tell people that they could actually help with their cancer. Because you can't make claims if it's not double-blind placebo-controlled trial, right? You can't make medical claims because the FDA says only drugs can treat disease. So if you do make a claim about a natural substance, then you're selling a, quote, drug. It transmutates into a drug when you make the claim. And so he was selling drugs without a license, went to jail 5 years. And by the way, he's back in jail now. He got out, and I think a couple months ago we read an article, he and now his mother are back in jail because I talked to Jason a couple years ago. He's like, I'm not going to stop. People need this information. They need apricot seeds. It healed my cancer, and people need this, and I'm not going to stop because the FDA tells me that I'm going to. So he's back in jail. And then here's one more report, 1953, the California report, same year as the Fitzgerald report. These are two doctors, let's see their names, McDonald and Garland, that were head of the California report. This again was about Laetrile, vitamin B17, which by the way is very effective at treating cancer. And it shouldn't be the only, it's not like a magic bullet. It's got to be coupled with diet changes, detox changes, lifestyle changes, emotional changes. There's a lot of different pieces to treating cancer, and emotions are a big part of it. But it's a good piece of the puzzle. But these guys came out with the California report of 1953, which is always referenced even today as part of the proof that Laetrile is ineffective. And so what they did is they did like a meta-analysis of the studies that had been done on Laetrile, and then they wrote like a doctor's summary. So doctor's reports will have like a summary page, kind of like if you're a non-doctor, think of it as a Cliff's Notes. Remember Cliff's Notes? Now they're all over the internet, so you don't really need Cliff's Notes. But when I was in high school, I was a master at Cliff's Notes because the English teacher would tell us to go read War and Peace, and I'd find a Cliff's Notes for it and read that. And then when she asked us about it, it sounded like I had read it when I really hadn't, because I read the summary. But what if the Cliff's Notes were wrong? What if the Cliff Notes were wrong? Well, that's what happened with their summary. They falsified the summary. So doctors that started reading about Laetrile read their summary that Laetrile was ineffective when the data showed that it actually was effective. And 10 years later, they came out and they both admitted they had falsified the summary. But that's still used today when people say, well, Laetrile's not been shown effective with cancer. It has been. And actually, there were studies in the mid-'70s at Sloan Kettering in New York City. A Japanese researcher, Kanematsu Segura, Dr. Ralph Moss was there. You're probably familiar with the Moss reports. He was there. And there was a big Laetrile cover up there as well. By the way, these were two of the doctors that were involved with the campaign to promote cigarette smoking as healthy back in the 50s. These two doctors. You remember the commercials? You know, my doctor smokes 1 pack of Marlboros a day for lung health, or for, Pall Malls helped me breathe smoother. You've seen the commercial. I mean, you can go out and look at on the internet. You can find the commercial, not the commercials, but the newspaper ads. And by the way, they both died of cigarettes. One of the doctors got lung cancer from smoking, and the other doctor died in a house fire caused by his cigarette that he was smoking when he fell asleep, and it burned his house down and killed him. So, not to make lightly of anybody dying, but it's almost poetic justice, it seems. But it's not just the DEA that's part of the conspiracy. The CDC is part of this conspiracy to suppress freedom and natural treatments, and specifically when it comes to vaccines, right? Who's familiar with the CDC whistleblower? Okay, maybe a fifth of the room. Dr. William Thompson, 4 or 5 years ago, came out and shared with Dr. Brian Hooker that the CDC knew that the MMR vaccine was causing autism and did nothing. Okay, this is not conspiracy theory. This is all over. We have 10,000 documents that have been released that were CDC documents, including internal emails back and forth from the head of the CDC to different scientists that basically told the scientists that had discovered this autism MMR link to destroy their data. Now, this is a quote from Dr. Thompson. He was one of the head scientists at the CDC. And this is the data that he's talking about. The omitted data suggested that African-American males who received the MMR vaccine before 36 months were at increased risk for autism. And it's recommended at about 18 months. And they were about like 3 to 4 times the risk of autism of the other kids. So what they do, they say, hey, if nothing else, hey, if you're African-American, don't get your baby boy vaccinated until after 36 months. At least they should have done that, right? Nope. Here's a note from Dr. Thompson in his own handwriting. He says, what should we do about the race effect? Should large effect for blacks and showed no effect for whites, large effect for blacks. In other words, this is his own writing. It says, we knew that the African-American baby boys were getting autism from the MMR. What should we do about it? In other words, we're going to cover it up, we're going to tell the people. And these are quotes from Dr. Thompson. They were ordered to destroy their data. People that have been my supervisors have broken laws. This is head scientist at CDC. The co-authors scheduled a meeting to destroy documents. The remaining 4 co-authors met me and brought a big garbage can. So they were going to throw away all their data. However, because I assumed that it was illegal and would violate both Freedom of Information and Department of Justice requests, I kept hard copies and I retain all associated computer files. So thank God that he kept them, because that's how we have them now. 10,000 plus documents released based on a FOIA request. And he says, I have great shame now when I meet families with kids with autism because I have been a part of the problem. That's CDC scientists. The CDC, are they protecting us? They're protecting us about as good as the FDA and the 100,000 deaths per year from prescription drugs properly prescribed. But if you're pro-choice in vaccines, not even anti-vaccine, just pro-choice. And by the way, we went to Autism One up in Chicago a couple years ago. Those mothers are lambasted as being anti-vaccine. They're anti-vaxxers. They're anti-science. What do they all have in common? They used to be pro-vax until the vaccine damaged their kid. So these are not like wild, buggy-eyed mothers. These are mothers that are becoming mama bear trying to take care of their family because they were pro-vax and vaccinated their kid, and now the kid is sitting in a corner drooling or dead, and they're trying to figure out what happened. But haven't they been proven to be safe and effective? This is an article in Scientific American, and by the way, very scientific name, must contain truth, Scientific American, right? This is an article, fact or fiction, vaccines are dangerous. And then here's their answer to that. Overwhelming medical evidence proves that negative side effects are rare and minor. So anytime you have an article, and I looked at this article, there's not a single study that's cited. But anytime you have an article that says there's overwhelming medical evidence that says this, beware. They didn't cite any of the evidence. Why? Well, because negative side effects are not really rare and minor. Who's familiar with an ICD-10 code? ICD-10. Medical doctors will be, because ICD-10 codes are what medical doctors use to bill Medicare. And there are 18 ICD-10 codes for vaccine damage. In other words, vaccine damage is so pervasive that they gave him 18 different vaccines to be able to use a code when billing Medicare so they could speed up their time because they were having to write it out. And now it's a code. So are they rare? I don't think they'd be giving you an ICD-10 code for something that didn't happen. They were so pervasive they gave him ICD-10 codes. And this is the popular vaccines: typhoid, cholera, plague, tetanus, diphtheria, pertussis, smallpox, rabies, typhoid, measles, polio. They're all in there. So here's what we have today. New CDC vaccines catch-up schedule has a child of 5 receiving up to 19 vaccines in 1 month. Who's familiar with Dr. Paul Offit? Okay. He was one of the doctors involved with the rotavirus vaccine. I think he's made over 30 million on that thus far. But he was quoted as saying that a child's immune system could handle up to 100,000 vaccines with no damage. It's like, are you kidding me? I mean, where do they get these people? And Paul Offit, by the way, was one of the, you're familiar with Vaxxed? Vaxxed2 is going around. So Vaxxed went to talk to Paul Offit. They just wanted a discussion. And that's what you're going to find is that they will not discuss vaccines. They are dogma in this sacred religion of vaccinology. And they will not discuss, they are safe and effective. And if you disagree, you're a heretic. But they won't discuss it. So the Vax bus went up there. And one of the guys that was filming goes into this little cafe where Paul Offit's sitting and asks him if he will discuss vaccines. He F-bombs him and says no and gets the security to escort him out. And this man that was on the camera has a vaccine-damaged child. He just wanted to talk about it, but they will not discuss it. Did you know this? That we have the highest infant mortality in the world, industrialized world, of the first world nations. And guess what? We have the highest number of vaccines for babies in the industrialized nations. And Miller and Goldman did a study on this about 10 years ago, and they studied, I think, the top 35 countries, industrialized countries, and they found out that, same data, U.S. has the most vaccines and the highest rate of infant death. And the countries like Japan, Denmark, Norway, Sweden have the lowest vaccine for kids. They have the lowest rates of infant death. But correlation's not causation, right? You always hear that. If you're talking about vaccines. Well, no, it's not causation, but you should at least investigate it, shouldn't you? But we're told, no, don't investigate vaccines. I was doing an interview. Who's seen Nico LaHood? He was in Vaxxed. He's a district attorney for Bexar County, San Antonio area in Texas. And so what he does is he's a prosecutor. And he says, this is the most bizarre thing to me as a prosecutor, because as a prosecutor, I'm told that if someone is in a house, 2 people are in a house and there's a gunshot, and one of the people, let's see, 5 people are in a house, there's a gunshot, 4 people run out. As a criminal investigator, I'm supposed to go talk to all 4 people. And I'm supposed to determine whether they were involved in the shooting in the house. But he said, what we're told with vaccines is that we're in a house, there's 5 people, 4 run out. You can only investigate 3 of them. The 4th person that represents vaccines didn't do it. We just know that they didn't do it. Why? Because that person has been safe and effective, proven. That person couldn't have done it because that represents vaccines. That's where we're at. And he said, as a prosecutor, this is the most bizarre thing to me, that sure, correlation may not indicate causation, but it should result in investigation. And it's exactly the opposite now. We're told, do not investigate vaccines, even though they're correlated with millions of damaged children at best and hundreds of thousands of deaths. This is an article that was just published, Harvard Public Health. Only half of U.S. adults think that vaccines are safe for most children. In other words, we're waking up. Have you heard of VAERS, the Vaccine Adverse Events Reporting System? This was introduced in 1986 when, did you know that you can't sue a vaccine manufacturer if the vaccine damages your kid? Raise your hand if you know that. Okay, so about half the room knew it. The other half is now learning it. You can't sue a vaccine manufacturer if the vaccine is proven to kill your kid. They were given immunity in 1986. So, I'm sorry?
I think it also includes the pediatrician.
It does. It does include the pediatricians as well. So, in 1986, the vaccine manufacturers and the doctors were given immunity. Can't sue them. So if vaccine damage occurs, you probably heard about vaccine settlements. So who do they sue? They actually started what's known as the Vaccine Trust or the Vaccine Slush Fund, whatever, it's called different names. It's the Vaccine Injury Compensation Trust. And so in 1986, they started charging an excise tax on the sale of every vaccine. And it goes into this big slush fund. And so then, since vaccine manufacturers can't get sued, you actually sue the Department of Health and Human Services if your child's damaged or if somebody dies from a vaccine. That's who you sue. And it comes from the excise tax. It doesn't come from the manufacturer. Manufacturers are immune. Doctors are immune. But since 1986, you can't really read this, but down here at the bottom, I just pulled this last month, $4.1 billion with a B has been paid out to families of people that were damaged from vaccines. So are vaccines safe? Well, the trust has paid out $4 billion in the last 30 plus years to people to families of people that vaccines damaged. So I guess by definition, they can't be safe. And Harvard just did a study that they estimate only 1% of adverse reactions are actually reported. So you could actually take that number, multiply by 100 to determine how much money should have been paid out. And do vaccines cause autism? Well, I mean, CDC already knew it. We talked about the whistleblower. This was the first case that the vaccine court ruled that the vaccine did cause autism. This was in 2009, I think, 2010. First family receives $1.5 million in the first ever vaccine. This is Hannah Poling. Hannah's father, John Poling, was not a construction worker or a janitor, nothing against those professions. He was a Harvard medical doctor that saw his daughter regress. And they sued they sued and won against the vaccine court. And it seems $1.5 million it seems like it should have been a lot more for a kid that's autistic for the rest of her life. So, have you ever heard of an MSDS? Okay, 15, thank you. Material Safety Data Sheet. This is the MSDS for Thimerosal, which is in a lot of vaccines still, believe it or not. We're told that it's not, but it is. Mutagenic effects for some mammalian somatic cells may cause damage to the kidneys, liver, spleen, bone marrow, and the central nervous system. May cause cancer based on animal data. No human data found. We hadn't studied on humans. But it may cause DNA damage and cancer in animals. That's the MSDS for mercury. Thimerosal. Okay? Thimerosal is about 50% mercury. Now, this is still in most vaccines. Okay? Because we've all heard it was removed, right? Well, they removed mercury almost 20 years ago. But did they? Because they can still contain trace amounts, right? Trace amounts. Bobby Kennedy did a documentary called Trace Amounts. That was his big thing a couple years ago, was the mercury. Now, he's really come out for vaccine freedom across the board. But that was his big deal, was mercury. So here's the interesting thing. And this is kind of like stevia. So stevia I like to sweeten with stevia. It's calorie-free sweetener, right? But the FDA determines that up to less than 0.5 calories per dose is calorie-free. But in order to get an adequate dose of some stevias, you got to put 3 or 4 spoonfuls in, depending upon, not the pure stevia, but depending upon the brand, which may actually end up resulting in 30 or 40 calories from a calorie-free substance, because the limit that the FDA determines is so small. So, FDA says, this is on cdc.gov, in the excipient media summary, part 2, It says where thimerosal is marked with an asterisk, it indicates the product should be considered equivalent to thimerosal-free. It may contain trace amounts less than 3.3 micrograms of mercury. So they're saying here's the limit. If it's below that limit, trace amounts is actually, it's deemed to be mercury-free, but it might not be. So let's do the calculation. I'm going to skip this calculation. It always screws up my PowerPoint. But in the calculation, I converted the typical dose of a vaccine that has 0.3 micrograms into parts per billion, because that's where we're used to seeing parts per billion. And I showed that a typical vaccine that is considered to be thimerosal-free, 0.5 milliliter thimerosal-free vaccine, can actually contain 600 parts per billion of mercury, which is 3 times the amount of what's considered to be hazardous waste by the EPA. Hazardous waste is 200 parts per billion, but a thimerosal-free vaccine can contain 600. Is it mercury-free? It's not. And you know what? There's also, if you look at the multi-dose flu shot, that still has thimerosal in it. And when I do the calculation on that, it's got 25,000 times the amount of mercury that's considered to be toxic waste. 25,000 times.
On that, you have aluminum in vaccines, but what like a lot of parents end up happening, they'll get the vitamin K shot for their babies, and it's 100 micrograms of aluminum.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. And vitamin K is not on here, but it does contain aluminum. A lot of these vaccines contain aluminum. And here's the problem. We know that aluminum is a neurotoxin, okay? And here's another problem. We know that aluminum, when coupled with polysorbate 80, passes through the blood-brain barrier. And many of these vaccines have polysorbate 80 in there as an emulsifier. But polysorbate 80 is the substance that that pharma uses to make sure that a drug gets through the blood-brain barrier. That's the carrying agent. So if you have a vaccine that's got aluminum and mercury plus polysorbate 80, and the doctor says, well, no, none of this, it's just trace amounts, it's a little bit, doesn't get through the blood-brain barrier, it does. Polysorbate 80 makes sure, it ensures that it gets into the baby's brain. Okay, and then this is on the FDA's CFR Title 21, Volume 4, Section 201.323. This shows that the allowable amounts of aluminum, no more than 25 micrograms per liter of aluminum is allowed. So I'm going to haul through this because I've got like 11 minutes left. But I calculate here how much aluminum is in most vaccines. And let me see if I can make this work, because I want you to see this. Maximum amount of aluminum per body weight. So the FDA shows that 5 micrograms per kilogram is the maximum amount of aluminum. And so that shows you that you need to have about 18 would be allowed for an 8-pound baby, and then 800 for somebody that weighs 300 pounds. It's weight dependent, right? So remember that 18 number for a typical baby. So then on the next slide, here's how much aluminum is actually in the vaccines. Maybe hit that. There we go. How much aluminum is in vaccines? Remember the 18 number. Pneumococcal, 125. HPV, 225. Hib, 225. Hepatitis A, 250. Hep B, 250. Penicillin, 330. DTaP, 170. Pediatrics, 850. Those all seem to be quite higher than the 18 that would be allowable by the FDA. But that's the amount of aluminum that's in these vaccines. Now here's what's interesting. This was the Sanofi Pasteur's DPT vaccine that was recalled a few years ago. It's called the Tripedia. It's for the diphtheria, pertussis, and tetanus. And on the package insert, it lists possible side effects, anaphylactic reaction, autism, and SIDS. They were listed on the package insert. And a bunch of mothers had the audacity to actually start reading the package insert, and just an outcry arose against this vaccine, so they recalled it. And then they re-released it under another name, didn't change it, and took those off of the package insert. That's the way it happens. Do not question vaccine safety or efficacy, or you will be called a conspiracy theorist if you read the package insert, because they're hiding it in plain sight. Causes these different things. And then look, Google, Facebook, the social media, there is an active campaign, let me tell you, to suppress this information on these social media platforms, period, and the search engines. I mean, Zuckerberg has come out and said, we're not going to allow anybody to question vaccines on Facebook, or we're going to shut them down. We've had social media, The Truth About Cancer has had social media accounts just vanish overnight. And the reason was it violates our policy against self-harm. So if you promote questioning vaccines, more studies on vaccines, then you might not give your kid a vaccine, so therefore you're going to harm your kid, therefore you violated our policy against self-harm, therefore we're going to wipe your account. That's happening. Amazon, they're on board as well. Don't question vaccines. They'll shut down your account. But is this misinformation? Haven't all the vaccines been double-blind placebo test studied, right? You have the double-blind placebo control group. That's the gold standard for drugs. Haven't vaccines been tested against a placebo? No. These are all vaccines, whether it's, I'm not going to read them all. This is a lot of the popular vaccines, all these names. There's one test on one of the versions of the Gardasil vaccine might, if you construed it loosely, have been tested against a placebo control. But it really wasn't. Bobby Kennedy went into that, and Del Bigtree went into that at our latest conference. They actually lumped some groups together to make it look like it was tested against placebo, but it wasn't. But the reality is there's not a single vaccine that's been tested against placebo control. Not a single vaccine. And they've never been tested when given in a multi-dose either. Our package inserts vaccine misinformation. Well, if you read the Flulavol vaccine, who got your flu shot? If you did, don't do it again. Don't. Because the Flulavol vaccine, one of the most popular vaccines for the flu, says, Flulavol, there have been no controlled trials demonstrating a decrease in flu after you get the Flulavol vaccine. It says it on the package insert. It says, we don't know if it works, but get your flu vaccine. That's what we're told. Go into any of the pharmacies, the Walgreens or CVS, huge signs, get your flu shot. Hey, we'll give it to you for free. And our little 18-year-old high school senior can give it to you. Would you like your flu vaccine, sir? No, thank you. I'm going to pass through here. This is our general practitioner doctor here. He's a family doctor, Dr. Kalb. Awesome dude. He's here in Franklin. He came out after he went to that Autism One conference a couple years ago that I talked about, and he basically said, we're not going to give vaccines here anymore, because he didn't know. And he learned, and he's like, we can't do this. He got attacked for a couple of years by the Tennessee Medical Board, almost lost his license. I think he's fine now, but this is a great guy that stood up against the tyranny. And look, it's not like if you want a vaccine that you can't get it at the next doctor. It's not like there's a shortage of doctors in Nashville that will give you a vaccine if you need it. This is one of thousands that just said, we're not going to do it at my clinic. And as a result of standing up for what he believes was the right position, he got mercilessly attacked and almost lost his license. Don't vaccinate, don't wait, vaccinate. This is the new campaign. Don't wait. Don't wait for studies to prove they're safe and effective. Just vaccinate. Just do it. Like Nike, just do it, right? Radcliffe says children must be vaccinated. I mean, they're talking about, you think it's bad in California, just wait if we don't stand up against this. California and New York is just the beginning. And it's not just, they're not just coming for kids. They're coming for you too. If you're 70 out here, there's proposed legislation to keep people from flying if you're not up to date on your vaccines. Why do you think they're digitizing all the health records? So they can have instant access to your vaccine records and determine if you're up to date. And there's legislation that as early as next year in certain states not being able to hop a domestic flight if you're not up to date on your vaccines. And who out here has gotten all their boosters since they were in high school? Nobody, right? It's literally tyranny because you should not be forced to be up to date on a medical procedure that has not been proven safe nor effective. That should not be a criteria to fly. Here's a quote from St. Anthony the Great. I want to read this to you. A time is coming when men will go mad, and when they see someone who's not mad, they will attack him, saying, you are mad. You are not like us. That's what's happening today with vaccines. Bobby Kennedy spoke at our last event, and he was quoted as saying, vaccines have become like orthodoxy, like a religion. You can't question them. The day after, or the week after that we had our event in Anaheim, Bobby flew out to New York City. The day after that, he flew out and was supposed to speak, I think at Sharpton's church in New York City, and they wouldn't let him speak on vaccines. And he went down to another church, and he was speaking about the dangers of vaccines, and they cut his mic. 10 minutes in, they literally cut his mic. And, I'm sorry, Hillsdale, yeah.
Who is they? Who cut his mic?
The people that were running the event at the church. They didn't want, I guess they hadn't done their research to see that he was actually going to talk about the dangers of vaccines. And a lot of, I go to church, a lot of church people are really in the dark as far as vaccines. And their culture, a lot of them are cultured in abortal fetal tissue too. So if you're pro-life and you're a Christian, you've got to think twice about some of these vaccines just from that DNA perspective, the human aborted fetal tissue DNA that they're cultured in. But so Bobby actually called us that day, and he's like, I just got kicked out of a church in Harlem. And so we went out into the street to finish his message. WHO says that anti-vaxxers are a globalist health threat. And I know I have 2 minutes, so I'm going to haul. Here's one of the poster children for vaccines, Ethan Lindenberger. I'm sure you've seen him. He's testified before Congress. Who is he? What kind of education does he have? He's a high school senior that says that he wants to be vaccinated, and his mom doesn't because she's read about it. And so now he's the poster child for, hey, everybody get your vaccine. This boy's standing up against the anti-vax nutters. And ask doctors if vaccines have ever been tested for causing cancer, and the answer is no. They all say on the package insert, have not been tested for carcinogenicity. We do not know if they cause cancer. And we've got vaccines now that we have kids now that are being born with 200 plus chemicals in their system that's in the umbilical cord blood. That's how kids are getting cancer, because their moms are toxic. Sorry, we got to haul through this. We know that glyphosate causes cancer. We know that it's causing a decrease in the honeybee population. We also know that 5G, which I'm not getting a chance to talk to, 5G is a big problem. It's causing a lot of the death of honeybees too. It's theorized. And I've got like 3 slides left and I'm done. And I have 1 minute. So we got to end in some humor. Humor is good medicine. Dr. Tony Jimenez knows about this. They practice, humor, laughter therapy at his clinic in Mexico. A bee that will not stop eating will eventually become a little chub bee. Ha, ha, ha. Right? But laughter is good medicine. We know that it stimulates the T lymphocytes, causes an immune response. We've measured the blood of people, and so we know that that's good therapy. That's why in Asia they do laughter therapy. It still says 9:59, so I have 2 slides. So, being that we have talked about conspiracies, I want to nix a conspiracy theory. It is a conspiracy theory that you have to. I already ruined it there. You have to exercise and eat well to have 6-pack abs. That's a conspiracy theory. You really don't. You can't have 6-pack abs without diet, without exercise. And this is photographic proof. So we'll end on some humor. Our message is that cancer is not a death sentence. There's always hope. Here's our contact info. Thank you so much. And it just hit 10 o'clock. So God bless. Appreciate it. All right.